There is a clipping in the New York Times archive dated December 20, 1897. The headline reads, "Strange Skeletons Found." It describes a discovery in Ohio where workmen digging in a gravel pit struck a stone burial vault containing human remains of extraordinary size. The article puts the femur length at exceeding any normal humans by a third. It names the township. It cites the local doctor who examined the bones. It mentions the institution they were sent to for further study, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Then the trail ends. Not because the story was retracted, not because anyone published a debunking. The trail ends because the bones never resurfaced. Not in a paper, not in a journal, not in a public collection. They went to Washington and they stopped existing. The Times was not a fringe publication in 1897. It was already the paper of record. And this was not an isolated story. Between roughly 1850 and 1930, more than 200 similar accounts appeared in American newspapers from Maine to California. Same pattern, same destination, same silence afterward. Skeletons of unusual size unearthed during construction or quarrying, examined by local physicians, photographed in some cases, then crated and shipped to the same address in Washington. And almost none of those remains can be located in any catalogue today. The standard explanation is that the reports were hoaxes, that 19th-century papers were credulous, sensational and prone to invention. There is real truth in that explanation. The Cardiff Giant of 1869 was a deliberate fraud that fooled an entire country before being exposed. P.T. Barnum exhibited fake mummies. Hoaxes happened constantly, but the explanation does not account for what is missing from the archive. It does not account for the photographs. Some of those 19th-century reports came with photographs, glass plate negatives, studio portraits of the bones laid out on planks for documentation. A few of those images survived in private hands. Most were sent to Washington with the bones, and like the bones, they vanished into the institution and never came back out. This is the question that should bother you, not whether giants once walked the earth. The earth is large and old and full of strangeness. The question is why a federally funded institution received hundreds of unusual remains over the course of 75 years and produced almost nothing from the receipt. No catalogue, no published study, no public display, no formal denial of the contents. Just a long, expensive, well-appointed silence. To understand what was being suppressed, you have to understand what those bones were briefly suspected of being. Not an extinct branch of humanity, not a missing link, something stranger and politically more inconvenient. The remnants of a civilization that, according to the most respected encyclopedia of its era, was once the largest country in the world. A country that today appears on no map. A country whose name modern scholarship has been trained to read as a smear, an error, or a poetic fiction. The country was called Tartary, and in 1771, the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica described it in exact detail, Volume 3, page 887. Tartary, a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and west. This is called Great Tartary. The encyclopedia listed its subdivisions and capitals. Moscow Tartary with its capital at Tobolsk, Chinese Tartary along the border of China, Independent Tartary with its capital at Samarkand, and the entry described Moscow Tartary as the largest country in the world. This was not a vague label for empty steppe. This was a recognized political geography in the most authoritative reference work of the English-speaking world, published while the American colonies were still British. Within 70 years, Tartary would begin disappearing from updated editions of the same encyclopedia. Within 150 years, it would be reclassified as a cartographic convenience. By the time the giant skeleton newspaper reports started accelerating in the 1880s, Tartary was already half erased from public memory. But its buildings were not erased. They could not be. They were too large. If you have stood inside any of the great cathedrals of Europe, you have felt what I am about to describe. The space does not feel proportioned for the people who currently fill it. The doors are too tall, the columns are too thick. The acoustics behave in ways that seem to anticipate a different kind of voice than the one a tourist guide brings to them. Hagia Sophia in Constantinople is the most extreme example, and it is also the example with the best documentation. Construction began on December 23, 532 AD, under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. The architects were Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. The cathedral was completed on December 27, 537, 5 years, 10 months, 4 days. The central dome rose 31 meters in diameter and 55 meters above the ground. It survived earthquakes that flattened most of the surrounding city. A modern engineer can describe the dome's geometry. A modern engineer cannot replicate the construction timeline. A 2015 structural study by researchers at Princeton, examining the load distribution of the dome, concluded that the construction sequence required tolerances and stress calculations that strain the documented capabilities of 6th-century Byzantine engineering. The study did not claim the building was impossible. It claimed the building was unlikely to have been completed in the time recorded, with the tools recorded, by the labor force recorded. The conclusion was politely framed. It said the historical record may underrepresent the period's technical sophistication. That is one way to put it. Cologne Cathedral in Germany is the example most often cited as a counter-argument. It was begun in 1248 and not completed until 1880. 632 years. Surely if cathedrals took 6 centuries to build, there is no mystery. But the explanation collapses on inspection. The medieval construction at Cologne was largely finished by 1322 for the choir. The work then halted for nearly 400 years and resumed only in the 19th century to complete the towers. Most great Gothic cathedrals were structurally complete within 60 to 80 years of starting. Notre Dame de Paris was substantially finished in less than 100, Chartres in 26, Salisbury in 38. The medieval period built at a pace that looks more like a centralized industrial operation than a peasant craft economy, and in the same period that those cathedrals rose, the same level of architectural sophistication appeared simultaneously across cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another. Star forts with identical angular geometry have been documented in over 105 countries. The Dutch fortress of Bortange, Goryeo-Kaku in Hokkaido, Fort McHenry in Baltimore, the Lahore Fort in Pakistan. More than 1,700 examples worldwide, sharing geometric principles so consistent that the Italian historian Carlo Cipolla once described them as evidence of a shared engineering tradition, whose origin no one has been able to locate. The official explanation is the spread of military architecture from Renaissance Italy. The unofficial question is how a Renaissance Italian fortification design ended up structurally identical from Japan to South America in less than 200 years, on terrain its supposed designers never saw. These structures still stand. The civilization that built them, according to the official record, was a series of unrelated cultures producing parallel achievements by coincidence. According to the 1771 Britannica, much of that geography was a single country. Then in August of 1944, while the Western world was focused on the liberation of Paris, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union issued a directive to the Tatar Provincial Committee. The order was to undertake a scientific revision of the history of Tartary, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians. The CIA report that documented this directive, declassified in 1999 and now publicly available in their reading room, used a different word than the Soviets did. Where the Soviet directive said scientific revision, the CIA analyst said falsified. He wrote that the goal was to distort the facts so that Russians always appear in a good light, and that histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed. That document is 14 pages long. It describes how the same operation was carried out across every Muslim region of the Soviet Union. Histories rewritten, museums purged, art objects confiscated, folk epics declared reactionary, scholars forced to revise their own published research. One Kazakh historian named Bek Makhanov was made to rewrite his own doctoral thesis to call his subject a reactionary instead of a national hero. The party demanded the change. The historian made it. The published record now reads the opposite of what his evidence showed. This is a documented operation. It was carried out on the ground that the Britannica had described as the largest country in the world. It coincided with 75 years of unusual archaeological discoveries on another continent being shipped to a single American institution and never being heard from again. And the buildings on both continents kept standing. The American chapter of this story turns on a single year and a single man. The year was 1894. The man was Cyrus Thomas, an entomologist turned archaeologist working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, the research arm of the Smithsonian. In that year, Thomas published a 700-page report titled Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. The report concluded definitively that the great earthwork mounds of North America, the structures at Cahokia and Newark and Serpent Mound and hundreds of other sites, had been built by the direct ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, not by a vanished race of giants, not by a lost civilization, by the indigenous peoples whose descendants still lived on the land. The conclusion was correct. Modern archaeology has confirmed it repeatedly. The mound builders were Native Americans, and the mound builder myth, which had imagined a lost white or European civilization predating them, was a racist fantasy used to justify dispossession. Thomas's report did important work, I want to be clear about that, but Thomas's report did something else as well. In demolishing the mound builder myth, it folded into its conclusions every anomalous skeleton, every unusual artifact, every newspaper report of giant bones that had accumulated over the previous half-century. The report did not address them individually. It did not catalogue them. It did not photograph them. It declared by institutional fiat that the entire pre-Columbian record of the Americas had been produced by populations whose remains fit a known biological range, and any deviation from that range was either a measurement error, a hoax, or a rumor. The case was closed. The Bureau of Ethnology moved on. What had not been accounted for was the physical evidence already in Smithsonian custody. The bones from Sayre, the bones from West Virginia, the bones from the burial mound at Spiro in Oklahoma, the mummified remains from caves in Nevada and Arizona, the reports of skeletons measured in person by named local physicians and shipped to Washington for further study. None of these collections were publicly catalogued in the wake of the Thomas report. None were displayed, none were independently re-examined. They were simply absorbed into the institution's holdings and stopped being mentioned. The institutional rationale was not malicious. It was procedural. The Smithsonian's accession records from the late 19th century are, by modern archival standards, incomplete. Specimens received during this period were often logged with minimal documentation, stored in basement collections, and never assigned permanent catalogue numbers. When the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passed in 1990, the Smithsonian was required to inventory its holdings of indigenous human remains for repatriation. The inventory revealed that the institution held the remains of more than 18,000 individuals. Many of these had been acquired during the same period the giant skeleton reports were arriving. Many had no provenance information at all. Tribal nations seeking the return of their ancestors discovered that the institution had catalogued their dead by box number, not by site of origin. The bones that came in answer to those 19th century newspaper articles are presumably somewhere in this inventory, or they were deaccessioned at some point, or they were destroyed. The institution does not know, in the strict sense of knowing. The records to support knowing were never created. This is the part that troubles me, because it is not a conspiracy. It is something stranger. It is what happens when an institution is given physical custody of evidence it has no professional incentive to investigate. Cyrus Thomas had closed the question in 1894. Once the question was closed, the bones became inconvenient, not threatening, not actively suppressed, inconvenient. The kind of inconvenience that produces poor cataloguing, missed publications, and eventually loss. The financial incentive to reinvestigate did not exist. The career incentive to reinvestigate did not exist. The institutional incentive was, if anything, slightly negative, so the boxes sat, and they kept sitting, for 130 years and counting. The same pattern repeats with the photographs. Glass plate negatives from the 19th century are fragile, heavy, and storage-intensive. Institutional photographic archives during this period were notoriously poorly organized. Plates were broken, mislabeled, water-damaged, or simply lost in moves between storage facilities. The Smithsonian's own anthropological photograph collection, which is now partially digitized, contains gaps in its accession record that correspond to the years of peak giant skeleton newspaper coverage. This is not proof of confiscation. It is, however, proof of an extraordinary degree of institutional silence around a category of artifact that, if real, would have been one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the era. I want to give the Steelman case its full weight here. Most of the 19th century newspaper accounts of giant skeletons can be traced to specific newspapers known for tall tales, to local boosters trying to attract tourism, or to misidentified mastodon and mammoth remains, which were genuinely common in the eastern United States and which untrained workmen routinely mistook for human bones. The skeletal measurements reported in many of these articles are physically implausible for any hominin. The Cardiff giant fooled scientists for months before its plaster origins were confirmed. The Calaveras skull was a hoax. Many of the most spectacular reports were produced during a period when American journalism prized sensational copy and verified almost none of it. The default explanation for the entire category is fraud, error, and journalistic excess. That explanation accounts for most, perhaps the great majority, of individual reports. What it does not account for is the volume. 200 and more reports across 75 years, in newspapers ranging from local weeklies to the New York Times and Scientific American, describing finds from geographically distant sites, examined by named local physicians whose professional reputations were on the line, sent to a federal institution that confirmed receipt and then said nothing. The fraud explanation requires a coordination of independent hoaxes that is itself remarkable. The misidentification explanation requires that hundreds of local physicians, dentists, and undertakers, in the absence of professional motive, repeatedly mistook elephant bones for human ones over 3/4 of a century, with the same misidentification pattern in the same direction every time. And the misidentification explanation does not address Lovelock Cave at all. Lovelock Cave sits in the Humboldt Sink of northwestern Nevada. It was excavated commercially for guano in 1911 by two men named James Hart and David Pugh, who began finding human remains and artifacts mixed in with the bat droppings. In 1912 and again in 1924, professional archaeologists from the University of California, Berkeley took over the site. The lead archaeologist on the 1924 expedition was Mark Raymond Harrington, a respected scholar with the High Foundation. Harrington's excavation produced thousands of artifacts. Among them were sandals woven from tulle reeds. The largest of the sandals measured approximately 15 inches in length, which corresponds to a foot considerably larger than the average modern humans. These artifacts were not destroyed. They were not confiscated. They are currently held at the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada, where any member of the public can view them. The local northern Paiute tribe had a legend about the cave. They called the original inhabitants the Siteka, which they translated as the people who eat tools. The legend described them as red-haired, unusually tall, and hostile, eventually trapped in the cave by the Paiute and burned out. The legend was old. It predated the white settlement of Nevada by an unknown but substantial period. When the artifacts were excavated in 1924, the Paiute legend was already part of the regional ethnographic record. Harrington noted the correspondence between the legend and the cave's contents in his published report. The professional archaeological community treated the correspondence as a curiosity rather than a confirmation. The Siteka, in mainstream scholarship, are described as a metaphorical or mythological construction rather than a literal memory. Whatever you believe about the Siteka, the sandals exist. They are 15 inches long. They were woven by hands that intended to fit them onto feet. The feet that fit those sandals belonged to people. Those people were not modern Paiute. They were not modern white settlers. They were a population whose existence is acknowledged by oral history, supported by physical artifact, and almost entirely absent from the institutional historical record. I sat with this research for nearly 3 weeks before I could write any of it. Not because the evidence was conclusive in any direction. The evidence is genuinely mixed. Some of it points to fraud, some of it points to hoax, some of it points to something the institutions have not been willing to investigate. What kept me staring at my notes was a more uncomfortable observation. Every time I tried to dismiss the entire category as 19th-century sensationalism, I would find another piece of physical evidence that did not fit the dismissal. Every time I tried to take the more dramatic claims seriously, I would find an exposed hoax that undermined the credibility of the larger picture. The honest position is the one no one wants to hold. The honest position is that something happened in the 19th century that produced a sustained, geographically distributed, multi-decade pattern of unusual archaeological finds. Some of those finds were certainly fake. Some of them were probably real. The institution that received the largest portion of them did not investigate them rigorously, did not publish on them, did not catalogue them properly, and now cannot account for most of them. The institution did not have to be malicious for this outcome. It only had to be incurious. And it was incurious in exactly the way you would expect of an organization whose senior researcher had recently published a 700-page report declaring the question closed. That is the pattern. And it is the same pattern that turns up in every territory the 1771 Britannica labeled Tartary. In Russia, the Bolsheviks ordered histories rewritten and the truthful ones destroyed. In Central Asia, the Soviets purged museums and reclassified national heroes as reactionaries. In North America, an institution received decades of anomalous evidence and produced almost no record of it. 3 different governments, 3 different ideologies, 3 different methods, but the same outcome. The pre-existing record was diminished. The institutions that processed the diminishment kept their procedural records intact, and the buildings, the ones that were too large to remove, remained standing as the only physical witnesses to a story that no one was being paid to investigate. The buildings are the part I cannot stop thinking about. Hagia Sophia is still operating as a place of worship after 15 centuries. The cathedrals at Chartres and Reims and Cologne still stand. The earthwork mounds at Cahokia, which once supported a city larger than London of the same period, still rise out of the Illinois soil. The star forts of Naarden and Boetange are still photographed by tourists who cannot explain why a fortification in the Netherlands shares its geometry with one in Japan. These structures were built by someone with techniques sophisticated enough that modern engineers can describe them in retrospect but cannot fully reproduce them on the original timeline. The hardware is intact. The instruction manual is missing. If you have ever wondered why old buildings feel different than new ones, this is part of the answer. They were calibrated to operate in a system whose other components have been systematically removed. The bells that filled them with sound were melted in 3 separate centuries by 3 different governments. The frequencies those bells held were standardized into a single global pitch. The traditional knowledge that maintained them was eliminated through targeted purges of the people who held it. The records that documented their construction were either lost, classified, rewritten, or quietly absorbed into institutional collections that never republished them. What remains is the stone. The stone remembers. The stone is the only witness left that cannot be edited. You can verify the framework of every claim in this video. The 1771 Britannica entry on Tartary is preserved in scanned form by the National Library of Scotland. The 1944 Soviet directive ordering the rewriting of Tatar history is described in the declassified CIA report titled National Cultural Development Under Communism, document RDP 78, available in the agency's public reading room. The 1894 Cyrus Thomas report on the mound explorations is available in full from the Smithsonian's own digital archive. The Lovelock Cave artifacts are on public display at the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada. The Hagia Sophia construction dates are recorded in the Byzantine sources of Procopius and Paul the Silentiary. The structural studies of its dome are published in mainstream engineering journals. The Nagpur inventory of Smithsonian holdings is a matter of federal record. None of this requires belief. All of it is checkable. What you cannot check is the silence. You cannot file a Freedom of Information Act request for an investigation that was never conducted. You cannot retrieve a publication that was never written. You cannot examine a photograph whose negative was never accessioned. The absence is the evidence, and the absence is, by definition, what the institutional record was designed not to record. The newspapers were credulous. The institutions were procedural. The decree writers in Moscow in 1944 were efficient. The encyclopedists who quietly removed Tartary from updated editions of the Britannica did their work over decades in editorial rooms with no ceremony. The result is what you see when you stand inside a 1,000-year-old building today and feel the strangeness of its proportions. The result is the size of the doorways at Reims. The result is the acoustic behavior of the Pantheon. The result is the 15-inch sandal in a glass case in a small museum in Nevada that no major institution has ever requested for further analysis. Once you start looking for the silence is everywhere. There is no plaque at the site where Cyrus Thomas closed the file on the mound builders. There is no memorial for the bones that arrived at the Smithsonian in unmarked crates between 1880 and 1930. There is no public acknowledgement that the great country described as Tartary in the most respected encyclopedia of its century was, within 4 generations, removed from every map. There is no register of the photographs that disappeared into institutional collections and never resurfaced. Each absence is small. Each absence has a procedural explanation. The procedural explanations taken together produce a record so smooth that it looks like it was never disturbed, and under that smooth surface, the buildings are still humming with frequencies they were designed for, in a key no one alive remembers how to play. A clipping in the New York Times for December 23, 1897 mentions a discovery in Ohio. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian acknowledged receipt. Nothing more was published. The local doctor's name is in the article. He died in the 1920s. His descendants, if any are still living, would not know what their great-grandfather examined on a December afternoon in a gravel pit in Ohio. The bones, if they still exist, are in a box somewhere in Maryland in storage with a number that does not correspond to any catalogue the public can access. The photograph of those bones, if one was taken, is on a glass plate in a drawer that has not been opened in 100 years. None of this is locked. None of this is classified. It is simply unfiled. And the difference between unfiled and unfindable in an institution the size of the Smithsonian is not a difference at all. The country where these things were not investigated calls itself the most documented society on Earth. The institution that did not investigate them is the largest research organization in the world. The encyclopedia that erased Tartary is still published, still updated, still respected. The buildings that no one can fully explain are still on their foundations, And the question that nobody seems willing to ask in any institutional setting, in any peer-reviewed journal, in any classroom, in any museum with a staff salary at stake, is what would have happened if Cyrus Thomas had taken the bones seriously in 1894? What would have happened if a single rigorous study had been published on the contents of those crates? What would have happened if the photographs had been printed instead of stored? The answer is not that we would know who built the cathedrals. The answer is that we would have a starting point for asking the question. We do not have that starting point now. The starting point was put in a box, and the box was put in a basement, and the basement was added to the institution's deferred maintenance list, where it has remained for 4 generations. Whoever built the structures that are still standing, built them. Whoever wore the 15-inch sandals wore them. Whoever was buried in the stone vaults that 19th-century workmen kept stumbling into was buried. The evidence of their existence is not entirely missing. It is held in custody by an institution that closed the case before opening any of the boxes. The buildings remember, even if we don't. The boxes are still in the basement, and the photographs the institution will tell you it does not have are not the photographs that were never taken. They are the photographs that were taken, sent to Washington, and never developed for the public eye. Somewhere in a climate-controlled storage facility in suburban Maryland, in a drawer that has not been pulled in a century, the negatives are sitting on shelves with no acquisition numbers, in folders with no provenance, in a room whose contents have not been audited by anyone outside the institution since the institution's founders died. The country called Tartary is gone from the maps. The bones are gone from the catalogue. The photographs are gone from the archive in the only sense that matters, which is the sense that no one outside the institution can find them. The buildings are not gone. The buildings are right where they have always been, waiting for someone with the authority to ask what they were actually built for, and by whom, and why the answers were considered worth this much silence.